Fandom. The word evokes, well, quite a lot of things. One may picture fan art and discussions on social media, cosplays, conventions, or the books, shows, and movies themselves. Although the word may have appeared as early as 1896, it was used mainly by fans of science fiction for the first half of the 20th century. In the year that I've been making this podcast, I've had the fortune to interview several fans in Minnesota. I usually ask a variety of questions, but I always ask this. Why is it important that we, as fans, tell our own stories? It's true that media representation of fandom has hardly been stellar. In 1939, Time magazine used the phrase, "Gosh wow, boy oh boy," to describe fan communication, which was quickly mocked by fandom. But I think that there's more to it than just giving a fair representation of ourselves to the non-fans of the world. After all, these days, fans of things like science fiction and anime are much less likely to be considered strange or mocked for their interests. One could state that science fiction is about looking forward, and broadly, they would not be wrong. But there would be no fandom of today without those, as Time called them 90 years ago, mostly boys of 16 to 20, the jitterbugs of the pulp magazine field. We, after all, are not so different than our distant ancestors who made the Lascaux cave paintings or graffitied the walls of Rome. As humans, we have always had an instinct to leave a mark. Fandom has been here for almost 100 years now, and fans have attempted to catalog our efforts for almost as long. Although preservation methods change, the intent stays the same. So, how do we preserve fandom history? I'm Skylar Schwartz, and you're listening to the finale episode of Season 1 of the Minnesota Fandom Factor. Minnesota Fandom Factor. To understand how we preserve fandom history, we need to go all the way back to the beginning of fandom. I recently had what I like to call a feldspar moment in reference to the popular webcomic XKCD's installment Average Familiarity. In the comic, two scientists discuss how many geochemical formulas the average person probably knows, and conclude that they must know one or two feldspars. The caption reads, "Even when they're trying to compensate for it, experts in anything wildly overestimate the average person's familiarity in their field." This maxim rung true when I stated to my mother, perfectly confident, "Well, surely the average person knows fandom was started in the letter columns of Amazing Stories." She informed me that no, they don't, and furthermore, they don't know what Amazing Stories was. Well, if you don't know the story already, I'm about to tell it, and if you do, content yourself with the knowledge that you are, as the comic says, an expert in the field. The year is 1926. The economy's better than ever, the first liquid fuel rocket has just been launched, and a man named Hugo Gernsback, a writer and editor of various scientific magazines, has started a magazine devoted to science-fiction called Amazing Stories. This type of story wasn't completely unheard of. 3 years prior, Gernsback had published a special science-fiction issue, and had in fact coined the term in 1915. But this was the first time the concept had a whole magazine devoted to it. You must remember that in 1926, the newsstand was of paramount importance in Anglophone culture, being the place where everyone got news, societal gossip, and fiction. Pulp magazines in particular were to become increasingly popular and important through the Great Depression. Amazing Stories, and Gernsback's later magazine Wonder Stories, also featured a letter column, a feature which you may have seen in comic books. Readers send in letters, usually at least tangentially related to the published stories, and with them include a full name and address. These are printed, with an editor's response, at the back of the next issue of the magazine. And if you read a particularly noteworthy letter of comment, or LOC for short, the writer's address was there for you to send a letter to them. Soon, very early fans began doing just that, sending letters to each other. While this is where most mark the beginning of fandom, other firsts are not so easy to define. The first fanzine, the first fan club, the first convention, these are all subject to debate. The main complication springs from the fact that in the early 1930s, fandom was very much intertwined with amateur science hobbies like rocketry. The prevailing belief, at least for a while, was that science fiction stories' main goal should be to get young people interested in actual science. As such, things like the International Scientific Association, a correspondence club founded in 1928, are more focused on the former half, science, than the latter, fiction. I personally designate the first science fiction club honor to a New York club called the Scienceers, whose 1930 founding and subsequent fan magazine, The Planet, also get them the honor of first fanzine. Subsequent firsts will only get more specific, like 1932's fanzine The Time Traveler, the first non-club fanzine that we have proof of, a category so specific that I'm just going to stop with the firsts for now. The trend continued. SF zines, both fan and pro, became more common, more fan clubs sprung up, and more people became fans, although fandom itself was still very small. Letter columns were still very important for fan correspondence. A pro magazine called Astounding Stories and its associated letter column Brass Tacks was home to the Staple War, a parody of more serious feuds whose participants argued passionately for or against the use of staples in fanzines, with multiple zines and clubs started for and against each side. The Staple War was just a bit of silliness at the time, but looking back, it feels rather ironic considering the serious arguments that were to divide fandom in the coming years. As I mentioned earlier, fans tend to disagree on everything, but specifically on what makes a first. The first convention is often agreed to have taken place on October 1936 in Philadelphia. This convention, however, was a gathering of about 10 fans without so much as a hotel reservation. A meeting the following year in Leeds boasted double the attendance, organized speeches, and an actual rented space. That sounds a little more like the conventions we're familiar with today. However, the Philly meeting would come to be known as the First Eastern Convention and established a fanish tradition here in the US. In fact, a later Philadelphia convention, PhilCon 1939, is the reason that we have Worldcon, one of the biggest science fiction conventions, today. But I digress. I won't spend too much time getting into the various fan clubs of the 30s, many of which were short-lived, contained less than a dozen members, and made minimal contributions to fandom. However, there are a few whose existence is relevant to our story. The Terrestrial Fantascience Guild, or TFG, lasted less than a year, but its zine Fantagraph continued into the 1940s. The ISA, mentioned earlier, although perhaps not very fanish in nature, claimed many fans as members. And the Science Fiction League, or SFL, started by Gernsback in 1934, whose many chapters contained dozens of fans from across the globe. Gernsback's contributions to fandom weren't all positive, however, and his tendency to avoid paying writers for his magazines ended up starting the first serious feud of fandom. A writer and fan named Donald A. Wollheim publicized his lack of payment from Gernsback for his story The Man from Ariel in the clubzine TFG Bulletin. Quickly, several other authors also came forward saying they hadn't been paid, some of whom hadn't been paid for years. Eventually, Wollheim and the others filed a lawsuit against Gernsback. These tensions continued when the former ISA, now ICSC, and the SFL began to feud. It all started when the SFL refused to promote the ICSC, despite the fact that they were rather different, with the ICSC being more science-focused. The SFL issued a statement that said, "We can see absolutely no advantage in your organization over the SFL." Ouch. So, the ICSC responded by parodying and leaving bad reviews on Gernsback's magazines, supporting Wollheim against Gernsback, and eventually attacking prominent fanzine Fantasy Magazine for not taking sides. It all culminated when the SFL expelled Wollheim from its membership, along with fellow writers Will Sikora and John Michel. But this was only the start of the feuding Wollheim would become involved in. In 1937, at a convention known descriptively as the Third Eastern, Wollheim read a rather inflammatory speech written by John Michel called Mutation or Death. Here is an exemplary line. "Internationally, science fiction is but the last gasping beats of a never very strong and young and healthy heart. What remains of it all is a gigantic junk pile of stinking literature and less than puerile achievement." The speech continued, saying that fans must have a purpose, and namely, to lead the charge of change in the world. The last paragraph, the most important, was as follows. "Be it moved that this, the Third Eastern Science Fiction Convention, shall place itself on record as opposing all forces leading to barbarism, the advancement of pseudosciences and militaristic ideologies, and shall further resolve that science fiction should by nature stand for all forces working for a more unified world, a more utopian existence, the application of science to human happiness, and a saner outlook on life." There was a vote on whether this should indeed be placed on record. It did not pass. But that did not mark the end of this concept, which came to be known as Michelism. The idea was continued on print in various fanzines, and a fierce debate began. Detractors, like fan Sam Moskowitz, quickly called it communism, or Bolshevism as it was known at the time. Others found the politics of it too extreme, or believed that fandom and politics should remain entirely separate. But regardless of one's view, it was undeniable that Michelism was at the center of fandom. This all culminated at the very first Worldcon, NYCon, in July 1939. There were about 200 attendees, making it the largest attendance of any convention so far. Fan Club The Futurians, of which Wolheim, Michel, and Sikora were members, had planned on attending, but were turned away. Another Futurian, Dave Kyle, had distributed a pamphlet through the con warning new fans of the so-called dictators running it, and it was aptly titled A Warning. Kyle strangely was admitted, but Wolheim, Michel, and 4 other Futurians were not. This decision came to be known as the Exclusion Act. Now you have the general backdrop of fandom. It was this year, 1939, a month before NYCon, that the very first fan history was published, Jack Speer's 1939 work, Up to Now. Somewhere between a long article and a short book, Up to Now is interesting but far from objective. Speer takes several more paragraphs to downplay his fascistic views than he does to describe the first ever science fiction convention, the previously described First Eastern. Despite that, it is still extremely relevant to telling this early story. One of the most important frameworks Speer established is the idea of numerical fandoms. The concept is essentially the idea that fandom could be divided into numbered periods centered around a focal point of activity, usually a certain prominent fanzine. Speer's idea of numbered periods dividing fandom was generally accepted, but the specific periods he assigned were not. For example, Speer's category First Fandom spanned 1933 to 36, and the years before it he called EO Fandom. Wolheim refuted this, placing the beginning of First Fandom in 1929, specifically at the date in which a letter was published in Amazing Stories announcing the existence of the ISA. Even more confusingly, a modern definition of First Fandom can include the entire pre-Worldcon period from 1930 to 1939. Although everyone seems to have a slightly different definition of when these occur, for the sake of clarity, I'll quickly go through the ones fan Dick Aney listed in 1959. After First Fandom came the first interregnum, or transition period. It ended with the founding of FAPA, the Fantasy Amateur Press Association. Although amateur press associations are relatively uncommon these days, and certainly less well-known than fanzines, they were incredibly important for much of fandom history. Essentially, an APA is a group in which everyone contributes their own zine, the zines are all collated into one big APA, and the result is mailed back to each contributor. Aney's second fandom went from October 1937 to 38, and was marked by an increase in the intensity of feuds. Aney's second transition went from the 1938 PhilCon through NYCon to the 1940 ChiCon, or Worldcon II. This was also marked by feuding and the Barbarian Invasion, a rather unkind term for an influx of new fans. Third Fandom went from September 1940 to 1944. The focal point in this case was fan Harry Warner's fanzine Spaceways, which used the superior method of mimeography. Of the accessible duplication methods of the time, mimeography was much higher quality and produced more legible copies. However, it did require a specialized machine. The inferior hectography produced fewer and worse-looking copies, but required only simple household items like gelatin. In Third Fandom, feuding had died down a bit, as Warner didn't allow it in his letter column. The third interregnum went from early to late 1944, and World War II was in full swing, meaning not much fan activity was happening. Fourth Fandom went from 1944 to 1947's PhilCon. Fan activity was mostly happening through the letter columns of pro magazines, as wartime paper shortages were affecting the publication of fanzines. Fifth Fandom went from 1947's PhilCon to mid-1950. The focal fanzine was Art Rap's Space Warp. Sixth Fandom went from early 1951 to May 1953. The focal fanzine was called Quandary. During Sixth Fandom, a very funny and iconic piece of fanfiction was published called The Enchanted Duplicator. The Enchanted Duplicator is a 1954 work described by Fancyclopedia 3 as a pilgrim's progress of fandom. The work chronicles the journey of Joe Fan through the lands of fandom on a mission to get a magical mimeograph and publish the perfect fanzine. Although the very nature of a satirical work whose target is a mimeograph makes the thing a bit dated, it really is quite funny and entertaining, and it was reprinted many times through the 20th century, with a sequel written in 1991. Many of its references have been explained earlier in this episode, everything from feuding to bad media coverage. When I first read The Enchanted Duplicator, I found myself getting weirdly emotional at the first paragraph, which I'll read now. Once upon a time, in the village of Prosaic, in the country of Mundane, there lived a youth called Jofan. Now this youth was unhappy, because in all the length and breadth of Mundane there was no other person with whom he could talk as he would like, or who shared the strange longings that from time to time perplexed his mind, and which none of the pleasures offered by Mundane could wholly satisfy. Each day, as Jofan grew nearer to manhood, he felt more strongly that life should have more to offer than had been dreamed of in Mundane, and he took to reading strange books that told of faraway places and other times. But the people of Prosaic mocked him, saying that the things described in his books could never come to pass, and that it was as foolish to think of them as to aspire to climb the great mountains that surrounded the country of Mundane. I mean, as silly as the story is, I think most of us have had this feeling at some point. That's the point of it, after all. Joe Fan is literally the archetypal fan. Anyway, I'd highly encourage you to read it if you haven't already. In 1953, young fan Harlan Ellison made an attempt to announce a seventh fandom, which mostly consisted of him and other youths decrying the older generation of fans and running around Midwest Con 4 carrying bird baths as both a symbol of victory and a sort of bizarre sexual euphemism. His announcement was widely mocked, and Ellison later left fandom, although not before declaring, "Those mad dogs have kneed us in the groin." Somehow, this statement did not incline the mad dogs to stop making fun of him. This is where our framework of numerical fandom ends, and although they remain a useful fan historical tool, the concept becomes unusable by the mid-1950s. After all, Worldcon attendance was regularly nearing the thousands at this point. Fandom was simply getting too large to have a singular focal fanzine, club, or controversy. Even just US fandom, because as you have probably noted by now, these early fan histories were very, very US focused. Fans in other parts of the world, especially Britain, had their own fanish doings, but those are perhaps stories for another episode. Up to now is not the only telling of this period. Several more attempts would be made over the coming years. Sam Moskowitz's 1945 The Immortal Storm goes into much greater detail than Speer, and Wollheim's article The Origin of Fandom gives his perspective. Speer's further efforts would become the 1944 Fancyclopedia, a catalog of events and terms which still exists today through its online descendant, Fancyclopedia 3. And much later, works like Damon Knight's 1977 book The Futurians would add to the narrative. A favorite fan history of mine is the Foxfire Project, started in 1983 and published in 2001, a fanzine whose contents consisted of, quote, a subjective history of early fandom, a history that isn't so concerned so much with facts, names, dates, and places, as it is with how it felt to be there as part of the newly born hobby of science fiction fandom. The project focused on the event of the First Eastern and printed letters from most who'd been in attendance, as well as background information on what the world was like in 1936. The project does a magnificent job of capturing that feeling, the giddy, nervous energy of teenagers who are doing something entirely new. And for all the feuding that marked the later part of the decade, it's refreshing to see something from the 1930s that just feels wholly positive. Although, as I've said, many fan histories cover the fandom of the 1930s, they each take a different approach. Here is what I've noticed. Speer. Up to now, which I've already discussed in some detail, is brief, dramatic, and serious or comedic at varying turns. Fancyclopedia 1 is longer, but functions less as a history than as an introduction into fandom as it was at that very moment in 1944. The alphabetical entries, while in keeping with the encyclopedic tradition, make it feel a bit scattered, alternating one-line explanations of nicknames and lengthy tellings of history. Speer's works are generally very colored by his own biases, but are still important in understanding the period, and without Up to Now, we may not have had the others. Wollheim. Wollheim's June 1944 article, The Origin of Fandom, appeared in a Fapazine, remember that's Fantasy Amateur Press Association, and was a direct response to Speer's efforts. The opening paragraph reads, "It is constantly surprising to note that in spite of the vast amount of writing and talking done by science fiction fandom today, very little attention is actually paid to the background and history of the field. Notice was brought to my attention that the only attempt at historical research in fandom has been done by one who is admittedly not very familiar with the earliest phases of the field. I refer to Jack Speer's several efforts at fan history. His data does not seem to extend much before 1936. Wollheim goes on to dispute Speer's definition of first fandom, a matter I have already referred to. He tells much the same story I have told of the early days of fandom, although its target audience is obviously different. Wollheim appears to be speaking to a young fan of 1944, one who is familiar with things like the SFL, but has no idea of their history. Alternately, Speer seems to be speaking more generally to someone who is interested in learning more about fandom. Although the content of the article is interesting, my main interest in it became a fixation on a detail not in the text itself. This detail became known as the mystery. The version of Wollheim's article I read was a scanned upload to fanac.org. While the text itself is pretty clear, on the fourth page there's an extremely blurry note someone had scribbled in the margins. On first inspection, it was somewhat readable, but for 2 words near the end. It read something like this. "Did Daw really write this in this something something style?" I became gripped by this possibly scathing review. What could this mean? I showed the blurry note to everyone, friends, colleagues, my boss. Eventually, my friend Oliver helpfully determined the second unknown word to be syntactical. The message now read, "Did Daw really write this in this something syntactical style?" This discovery only increased my interest. I vividly recall staring at my phone screen for an entire half-hour bus ride, peering at the blobby letters. I was probably muttering to myself as well. However, at the end of it, a meaning had emerged. The word was incredible. The word was literally incredible. If you are viewing this podcast, I will highlight the letters. The author, whoever they may be, had a nasty habit of writing in alternating upper and lower case. Of course, they probably didn't assume someone would be dissecting their note over 80 years later. The message was now finally clear. Did Daw really write this in this incredible syntactical style? A vague message, perhaps, but at least I had determined it. Of course, if you are watching this and are completely convinced it says something entirely different, comment below and persuade me. I'll leave you with another quote from the article, and you can determine for yourself whether Wollheim indeed wrote in an incredible syntactical style. While I do not entirely accept Speer's version of fan history, for the sake of the story, let us imagine that fandom does operate in recurring waves. In that case, there is an entire fandom about which Jack Speer has not heard, or else never recognized. This might truly be called the first fandom, and all the others shoved back accordingly. It covers a period from 1929 to 1934. 1933 to 1934 is what Jack Speer calls an interregnum, a period between fandoms, a period lacking direction, order, and definite centralization. In 1934 arose the beginning of the type of fan we know and understand. For that reason, one may call the fandom that went before pre-fandom. Moskowitz. If you found my introduction, comparing fanzines to the Lascaux cave paintings, to be lofty or overly serious, it pales in comparison to the gravity and seriousness Moskowitz takes. Here are a few lines from his work The Immortal Storm to show you what I mean. It may be felt by some readers that this professed history of fandom is too bibliographical in nature. If so, let them reflect upon the fact that the early fan publications were not only the pride, but the very foundation of the field. More, they were the existent proofs that the fans were capable of more than criticizing the professionals and quarreling among themselves, that they possessed the ability to think and act constructively. The lives of these publications is consequently more important than 90% of the rest of fandom's history. For, since history is essentially a systematic record of man's progress, we turn to their magazines to discern the story of science fiction fans' progress, and progress it was. The outgrowths of the publications all too often bore the stamp of degeneracy and decadence. Moskowitz also frequently made classic and poetic allusions. Since the dawn of time, man has woven his fantasies, fabricated his gods and their imaginative origins, told tales of things beyond the range of his senses. The Old Testament contains not only the fantasy of Adam and Eve, but also more than one out-and-out ghost story as well. The Iliad and the Odyssey, two of the greatest ancient works, are forthright, unblushing fantasies. So is Beowulf, the oldest written saga in English. A quality all the early fan histories share is a lack of scope. Fandom was just a few years old when they were written, after all, and most of them seem to have the attitude that the reader would inevitably end up meeting or writing to those described anyway. Although the works were surely not intended to be read nearly a century later, it can be difficult to read them without further context. The Immortal Storm's near 200 pages feels in places simply like a list of unknown names and dates. Still, even with these shortcomings, the works are incredibly important to fan history. Beyond these works are other primary sources which are of great help to the fan historian. One of these unintentionally helpful tools is the fanzine catalog, a list of current and past fanzines, usually with a brief descriptor on what they do, prominent contributors, and location. The first of these appears to be called Science Fiction Bibliography, a 12-page pamphlet published in 1935 by William Crawford. A more well-known and longer-lasting endeavor was the Swisher Index, officially called the SF Checklist, and first published in 1938 by fan couple R.D. and F.N. Swisher. It ended sometime in the 1940s and was succeeded by the Evans-Pavlat Fanzine Index, which published from 1952 to 59. Although various other cataloging efforts were made, the same issue was faced as by those who attempted to continue numerical fandom. The 1950s and 60s saw a massive rise in the number and activities of fans. This process, that of preserving fanish traditions and history, is often known as time binding, and is said to have first been dubbed such by Robert A. Heinlein in his guest of honor speech at the 1941 Worldcon. Your intrepid researcher here took a look through a transcript of his speech, and while I did find Heinlein's exposition on the original author of the term, use of the actual term itself is missing. Regardless, all of my research had me curious as to how time binding had changed, well, over time. Clearly gone are the days of fanzine indices, but what remains? I figured I'd better consult with an expert, and who better than Sarah Barsness, head of the Convergence Archives Department. All right, cool. All right, so today I have Sarah here. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. So, hi, I'm Sarah Barsness. I am the archivist for Convergence, which is a fan convention here in the Twin Cities.
Awesome. So, what work do you do as the archivist for Convergence?
So a lot of the work that I do is sort of supporting the organization. There are folks working on publications. There are folks working on TV, on main stage, right? And they create a lot of stuff, and they need to manage that stuff, and they need to know what to do with that stuff. And that's kind of what I do day to day for like my paid job. And so when I learned that Convergence needed an archivist, I signed up to volunteer.
Awesome. Something that I like about Convergence is that it's like a con on the smaller side, but the management is like amazing. It's so good. There's so many people doing things and helping and stuff.
Absolutely. It is, to me, one of the kind of quintessential Upper Midwest conventions in that it is entirely volunteer run, right? It is all people who thought, this is cool, but it could be cooler, and I will make that happen personally. And then they just stick around and kind of make like a fun family reunion almost. It has a really like community family reunion feel to me, which I love.
Yes. Yeah. Convergence was my first convention, and I was maybe like 7 when I went for the first time. So
yeah, it was mine too. I was in college. I think I was a freshman in college when a college friend who I met in Wisconsin was like, hey, you're from the Twin Cities. We're going to Convergence. She hauled me over, and I have gone every single year since.
oh, that's so fun. Oh my gosh. Okay, so what inspired you to become an archivist, like professionally, whatever?
It's a long story that I wish was cooler. I graduated with my undergraduate degree in liberal arts in 2008. And I don't know if you remember what the economy was like in 2008, but it was bad.
Bad.
It was a bad time to have a degree in anthropology. So I jobbed around. I was a barista, which like you're legally obligated to do if you have a bachelor's degree in anthropology. And I got a gig selling audio guides at the Science Museum of Minnesota for the King Tut exhibit.
Ooh.
And it was very fun. I loved it. And I knew I wanted to go back to school. I knew I wanted to get at least a master's degree. I was looking at different programs, and anthropology was just not going to happen. It was really expensive, and there are not a lot of jobs. So I started looking and I saw library school and I thought, well, that sounds great. I like to read, which is a bad reason to go to library school. Don't go to library school because you like reading, kids. You don't have time to read.
Oh man.
Yeah. But then I saw archiving as a specialty and I thought, that's it. That's what I want to do. I got there, I started taking classes, and they said, the jobs in archives are really in digital archiving. And I said, wow, I've been using computers since I was like 3. Let's go. And that's sort of how I got started.
Oh, that is cool. Don't undersell yourself. That is interesting. Oh my gosh. So you're an archivist professionally and also for Convergence. What do you find important about archiving specifically for fan works?
I think one of the things that I really enjoy about this work is that I get to think about stories. It's really all about stories for me of, who was here and what did we do and how is that a part of something bigger, right? Because all these little stories that you find in every sort of artifact or every file on a computer, right? It tells like a little piece of a story. And being able to look at all those different pieces and make educated decisions about which pieces to keep and which pieces to get rid of and how to best kind of preserve that story and pass it on is really, really fulfilling to me. I'm also a nerd and I love the technical aspect to it.
Yes.
I really like finding like Lotus 1, 2, 3 stuff and being like, oh yeah, let's dig it up.
That is so fun. I haven't talked about this on the podcast before, but I have been considering a future career in archives for a while, and someone asked me about it. Oh, why do you want to do that? And I was like, because it's like you're preserving pieces of history. Like it's pieces of the story, and you get to kind of put them together and learn from that. And that is so cool.
There's also a lot of feelings. I will say one of the things that is a challenge sometimes in archives is that trash is sometimes just trash, know?
Yeah.
And people sometimes have a lot of really big feelings about things that might not tell as many stories to an outsider as they do to that person because the object itself carries like memories, right? Yeah. And so helping people kind of go through those feelings and through that journey of understanding what I'm looking at and understanding what they feel and being okay with letting go of something or deciding that actually, yeah, I really want to keep it. I am the right home for this thing because it's my story for me, that can be really challenging sometimes, but also really fulfilling to kind of help people through that.
That's really interesting. When you're doing this work, do you have a favorite piece or like a favorite part of the process?
I think when it comes to the Convergence archives, I think my favorite piece in terms of research value is probably going to be the progress reports.
Oh, yeah.
Because these are things that would be put out like quarterly, I think. And it would just be like a list of like who's been working on what and where things are at and what's going on. And it's just this really kind of almost blow by blow of how the convention came together every single year. And that's so fun to see it happen. But in terms of just kind of cool fun, I think my favorite is, I don't know if you ever saw any of the Convergence pass-around games.
Oh.
For anyone who doesn't know what they are, because they've never been to Convergence, back in the day, people would design a game. And the game involved getting the game, following the instructions in the game, doing the thing, and then passing it on to somebody else. And when there were, fewer than like 5,000 registrants, it would go to everybody. So they stopped doing it eventually. The registration numbers just got so high, the game would get lost half a day in. Nobody would ever find it again. So now it's side quests at the bridge, which is a great way to learn where the bridge is so that you know where to go if there's a problem, right? And then they'll just give you a fun side quest.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much to do at Convergence. I have gone to it so many times and I haven't done everything yet. There
is something for everyone at Convergence. The way I get all of my friends to come with me to Convergence is I just start listing things that happen. I'm like, okay, so almost 24/7. There's a movie room, there's a TV room, there's a game room, there's like video games, there's a craft room. Do you like crafts?
Yeah, I was, we had corresponded about it, like on email, and I was looking through the Convergence archives, and I saw in one of the old programmed books there was an advertisement for a Firefly Doctor Horrible crossover event in maybe 2011, and I was just so jealous that I did not get to go to that. And I also sent it to several people who I knew would appreciate it, and one of whom was like, I could have gone to that, and was incredibly upset that they didn't. But
Well, I mean, you could always volunteer to bring it back.
I know it's my turn. I'm
Yeah.
taking over on that. Oh, that's great. So obviously you have progress reports and program books and stuff. Do the Convergence archives exist physically? Are they just in a box at someone's house?
Yes, they're in several boxes at my house.
Oh, love! Oh, you have them.
Yes, I do. I physically have them. We have several boxes of paper programs. I actually still get a paper program every year. This is the
Oh, yeah.
kind of big color souvenir program.
Oh, yeah, I get that.
Yeah, and I just kind of keep it in my file. I also keep all my ConCom badges so you can see what the badge art was like, and a few things like that. Because it's actually cheaper and easier to save things in paper than it is digitally.
Yeah, because of the uploading, or
How technical do we want to get?
ooh, explain to me.
Okay. So with digital archiving, there's 3 kinds of obsolescence that we worry about. The first one is the carrier, right? If it's on a zip disk or a floppy disk, that thing might not last forever. It definitely won't last forever. It's magnet-based. And so we got to get the information off of there as fast as we can, and as soon as we can. The other kind of obsolescence is going to be the file format itself. Is there software that can faithfully render that information to show you what the person who made it would have seen? And sometimes it can be kind of deceptive. I recently did a collection that had doc files, .doc, and I thought, oh, that's no big deal, right? Those are pretty recent. Nah, fam. They were from the first version of Microsoft Word for Mac.
Oh, no.
Microsoft Office doesn't render them properly anymore. You can't read them. So I had to do a bunch of research to figure out what will read them. And it actually turns out open source software does much better.
Love.
Yeah. LibreOffice, shout out LibreOffice. They saved me on that one. So file formats and carriers. And then the third one is the ones and zeros themselves, right? No matter what they're saved on, those bits can just kind of flip or go missing.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen a lot, but because there are so many bits that we're saving, it can happen. And so bit loss and bit rot is something we worry about. So there's just kind of this constant churn of moving things to new storage media, backing things up, having different formats of backup, geographically separated, right? And it's this constant moving dance. With paper, if you put it in a box in a place that is dark and kind of cool and dry,
It'll be okay for
it'll
a
be
while.
fine.
Yeah.
And even the dry and the cool isn't a set thing. As long as it's about the same, no big fluctuations, it'll last for centuries all on its own without any extra work.
I was looking at these very old fanzines from the 40s and 50s that had been preserved, hectographed and mimeographed,
Yeah.
and just it's if you're not uploading that, they're fading.
Yeah, that's true.
But generally I never thought about that. There's a lot of work that goes into this.
It's something you learn in library school that you spend a lot of time on, is learning kind of all these different ways of making things and what the strong points and weak points of them are. I'm much better versed in digital carriers. We can talk about how CDs are terrible for days. But with paper stuff, I'm kind of a little less familiar, but I know some things. So yeah, mimeographs. Mimeos, I think, are light sensitive. So are cyanotypes, anything like blueprints. And they just fade with light really, really easily. There are some things you can do to kind of keep them going a little bit longer, but not much. Depending on the era, also, the way that the paper's made can really make a big difference. Anything that's sort of Victorian era and earlier, the paper tends to be pretty high quality. I've handled newspapers from the 1700s that look like they're brand new, bright white, super soft and flexible because they're made with cotton. instead of cellulose.
Oh,
The
yeah.
fibers are much longer. It stays nicer for longer. But then if you look at a newspaper from like World War II,
Decaying.
oh my gosh, they're brown. They're burning. They're physically burning because they're so acidic. They're burning themselves.
Oh.
And you just touch a corner and it just flakes away.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
That is intense. Um, so how has archiving changed, and how will it continue to change as digital mediums become more prevalent?
That's a great question. And I think that's one that we don't entirely know the answer to. And I don't know if we ever will. I think for a while, society thought we were going to manage the paperless office, right? That was going to be a real thing in society. And I don't think that's panned out that way.
Yeah, I think that we're always going to use paper, at least for
Yeah.
the foreseeable.
Yeah. And I think there's this interesting thing now where you're seeing we've reached maybe kind of peak digital supremacy in the sense that people are now turning back to more analog pursuits intentionally.
Absolutely.
And analog formats, right? Vinyl is huge again, and that is fundamentally an analog format. That's a needle moving around in a groove that makes weird echoes that happen to sound like music.
Yeah.
Records are sorcery.
They're great.
They are. I love them. And digital formats are just fundamentally so much more complex, and they're a lot harder to kind of interface with. And the way that our digital world works, it's also really hard to see what's going on kind of inside of a service or inside of a file. You don't understand what's in there. So I think we had this dream for a while of this paperless office that was never going to happen. But what we're seeing now in the archives is we get hybrid collections. We very rarely get something that's all paper or all digital. It's always kind of a mix. And so our difficulty is in finding where the overlap is between the physical stuff that gets sent and the digital stuff. How do they relate to each other? Do they duplicate? Is it worth keeping one over the other? Do we need both? What story does that tell if we keep both? And then, as time goes on, I think the amount of digital will kind of go up and the amount of paper might go down. But I think it will really kind of continue to depend on the person, and also when they give their stuff to us.
Sure.
I think there's still a lot of people who think, well, it's on a computer. It can't be old enough to go to an archive. No,
No.
it's absolutely old enough.
We've had computers for a while.
Yes, they have been around.
Just because it's digital doesn't mean it won't degrade.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Is there anything else you want to share about anything, really? It's okay if not.
It's like the job interview when they're
Oh
like,
my
do you have any
gosh.
questions for us? And you're
I
like,
don't want to stress you
none.
out like
Please
that.
feed me. Please pay me. I would like to buy ramen and rent. No. I think something that is really valuable about archiving this kind of stuff and keeping these stories, not just the Convergence archive, but also like AO3, right?
Love.
And all these other kind of homegrown efforts, right? They're a kind of what we call in the archives world community archiving. We are the community and we are archiving ourselves because we know what's important and we know what our values are. And I think one day there will be kind of more traditional archives that are interested in having these materials. In fact, there kind of already are. There are starting to be sort of bigger places and museums who want to tell these kinds of stories. And the work that we're doing right now is the foundation for people in 50 years, in 100 years, to understand how this happened and sort of what happened here and how like fan culture existed through the years. And I think that's really beautiful and cool, right? It's
Yeah.
our gift to the future.
That's so awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yes. So, we've seen time-binding efforts from the 1930s and the modern day. But how have our attitudes around fandom changed? The first thing that I feel really changed was known as the Gernsback delusion. Named, of course, for Hugo Gernsback, the idea was that science fiction should exist as a kind of sugar-coated way to get young people interested in actual science. This is why many early clubs like the ISA and Scienceers were partially science-focused and partially science fiction-focused. This idea quickly fell out of favor. However, I believe it lingered in the idea that science fiction must be scientifically plausible to be of value, a concept which hung around fandom for much longer. Next was Michelism. In the original Mutation or Death speech, Michelism was given as a possible purpose to fandom. Even though the goal was political instead of intellectual, the underlying thought was the same. Science fiction fandom must serve some greater purpose. Another idea from that time is that it is perhaps silly to take interest in fandom too seriously. The terms sercon, meaning serious constructivism, and fiawal, meaning fandom as a way of life, were both invented as pejoratives. And frequently, in my undertaking of this project, I have chastised myself for being too sercon about the whole thing. But is that really such a bad thing? Fandom was started by a group of young people messing around in the 1930s, having silly feuds and coining silly words with no idea that they would change the world. It is perhaps not something to be taken that seriously. But we devote time to fandom and meticulously time-bind for a reason. For all the debate on whether fandom should be for the advancement of science, or of humanity towards utopia, or another cause, I find the most meaning behind the friendships and connections that people make through fandom. Despite our differences, like Joe Fan, we all have that same inexplicable feeling of connection to science fiction. And that's the one element of fandom that hasn't changed a bit since the 1930s. The Minnesota fandom factor. Of course, there is so much more I wish I could have covered. Fanish theology, fan funds and their various associated feuds, more fan histories. But I only have a finite amount of time on this earth, and if I did not stop myself, my scripts would stretch forever towards infinity. So, if there's a particular subject you'd like to see covered in Season 2, leave a comment. Thank you to fancyclopedia.org, fanac.org, and sf-encyclopedia.com for providing much of the information used on this podcast. They are invaluable resources, and I highly recommend them. Also, thank you to my boss. Thank you to Oliver for helping me with the mystery, and thank you to my mom for tolerating all of my complaining about terribly hectographed and scanned fanzines. Thank you to my family and friends who've listened to every episode of this podcast. And thank you for listening.